When you think iconic 90s Seadoo, you think XP first, right? Well, maybe wrong. The seadooxx, one of the most iconic machines from the 90s, gained its signature lean-in riding style, separating the good from the elite riders. A machine built to shake up the PWC world, both on the race circuit and with enthusiasts alike, providing the ultimate technical sit-down PWC riding experience. So I think it's only fitting that we finally take a look at the history of this iconic machine. Guys, you know what to do. Hit the subscribe button and let's get into the video. Everybody knows at this point, they've heard me bang on about it enough, the XP for the 90s for Seadoo was the flagship high watermark. But what I've not talked so much about is the iconic seadooxx. The seadooxx was a direct response to the equally iconic Yamaha Wave Blaster. The Yamaha Wave Blaster, the original blaster, burst onto the scene in 1993, and the blaster, as we all know, went on to carve and forge its own legacy in its own right, which we'll cover in another future video. So what did Seadoo do at that time to react? Well, in 1995, Seadoo dropped the HX, a race-focused, stripped-back, narrow hull, which was designed for one thing: to go head-to-head with Yamaha. Although a production lifespan of just 3 years from 1995 to 1997, it was a pivotal part in Seadoo's development and informed the distinguished final gen parabolic XP. The HX was Seadoo's first attempt at a truly crossover ski. They went all in with the narrow hull and the low center of gravity. This gave it handling more like a stand-up, but with the balance of a more traditional sit-down. A watercraft that rides like a motocross bike on the water. A watercraft to dethrone the iconic Blaster 1, and a riding style predicated on true lean-in, shift your body weight, physical workout ski. Plus, Seadoo set about introducing their own unique set of features, most notably the distinctive tunable adjustable spring seat. Riders could adjust the seat based on their own weight, which was an unheard of feature back then. The thing is, Seadoo knew that the HX had to operate in a completely different lane. They already had the renowned XP, and that was doing really well from a sales point of view. The X4 with the 787 and 717, and the XPs that even come before that with the Gen 1 and Gen 2 SP hulls, they were beloved by the riders and the racers alike. So if the HX was going to be successful, it had to do something new. How did they achieve this? Well, the HX was a specifically designed hull for the elite rider. It required a whole new level of rider agility to maximize the riding potential. The HX would go on to race in the sport class and go directly up against the Blaster 1. And whilst on paper, and not a lot of people realize this, back then the HX could actually go up against the XP or the Wave Raiders of the time. In reality, it was really going up against the Blasters and the lighter, more agile carving skis. The HX with the smaller 717 wasn't designed to go head-to-head against the bigger brother in the 787. And it certainly wasn't designed to go up against the 1100 beast in the Raider. Off of the race course, the HX was even more of an acquired taste. For the recreational rider, you either loved it or hated it, a little bit like Marmite. That might have constituted as to why the HX only lasted for 3 years. Sales-wise, I don't think it ever really hit the heights that the XP or the Raiders did, because it was that acquired style of hull. For racing, great, because it did a certain job, but for recreational riders, the XP did a lot more stuff more effectively for a mass market audience. Whilst the HX only lasted 3 years and maybe didn't hit the heights of the XP, it really was a vital piece in Seadoo's development because it informed the final gen XP. And when I say final gen XP, which by the way, if you want to learn more about the XP and that history of that amazing machine, watch this video here. It's a video dedicated from 1991 all the way through to 2004. But in essence, in 1997, we saw the introduction of the final gen Parabolic V with the iconic spring seat. Now initially it started as a 787, as we know, which stole that engine from the beloved X4 XP. It was slightly underpowered in 97, but it obviously went on to the 951, and that became a renowned machine. I have the XPDI variant of it, and that had the exact same style of spring seat which featured in the HX. Obviously, the final gen XP got wider, fatter, heavier, more compliant. Compliance is that word again. But the origin story was there from the HX. For me, when I see a final gen XP, it seems synonymous with the HX, and that's one of the main reasons me and my dad chased down the HX for so long. I'll let you guys argue out in the comments if the HX, the XP, the X4, the Parabolic V, or even maybe the Raider is better. So put in the comments, you guys can decide. So I'm going to try and quickly whiz through some of the features and details about the HX. As I said, it only lasted for 3 years, and throughout all of those 3 years, it featured the same 717 reliable engine that we saw in the XP that I have. The 717 was considered the bomb-proof option, but for the HX, it was perfect because it was all about controlled power delivery. The nuances within the HX were decided by rider's skill and how you could really carve and lean that machine over, so the 717 was the perfect power to weight ratio. Yes, in years after, as with all of these great machines, people shoehorned in bigger engines, the 1100 Cowies. We saw this on the Blaster as well, but for its time and its period, the common consensus is the 717 was the perfect engine for that hull. Now that 717 only put out a modest 85 horsepower, which when you consider to the Blaster 1, although the Blaster was only 701cc, it output 110 horsepower, so more bang for your buck with the Blaster. That being said, the Blaster was heavier. It was 440 pounds to Seadoo's 400 pounds. In tandem, the Seadoo, as I've touched on, was narrower than the actual Blaster. So a lot of people for that time considered the HX the more effective carving ski. Now again, argue it in the comments. The Yamaha fans are going to say the Blaster was better, and the Seadoo fans are going to say the HX was better, and some people are going to say the X4 was better than them all. But the point is, narrower, lighter normally means it's going to be a more effective cornering ski. Another cool feature of the HX, and what I really like about the story arc of the HX, is it featured manual trim, a little bit like my original gen XP. I have the 91, so I don't have any trim. They introduced that on the 92. But when we say manual, I literally mean manual. You'd go to the pump area on the rear of the HX and you'd actually turn a knob to get it to adjust the pitch of the nozzle. The whole premise of the HX was to strip back the complexity of the machine, which is kind of crazy because these machines, even the most highly spec'd XPs of that time, are now primitive by today's standard. But the point is, it didn't have electronic trim. Trim allows the racer and the rider to be able to dial in the exact pickup, the nozzle position. So these little nuances were really important. In reality, it was a bit of a gimmick because you weren't really jumping off mid-race and adjusting your trim. So what Seadoo cleverly done, and a detail I absolutely love having now restored a 1996, lots of videos coming soon, is if you look at the front of a Seadoo HX, you'll see 2 blanked off caps. They say Seadoo on them, so it's original. And if you take those caps off, you have 2 pre-cut holes to drop in 2 gauges. Now the 2 gauges would have been optional extra upgrades directly from the manufacturer back in the day. You could have gone into the dealer and say, I want a 1995 HX and I want to take a fuel gauge and I want to take electronic trim. And what they would have done is obviously they would have dropped the 2 gauges in, which you can now pick up for a pretty penny, which I may have done. Stay tuned, hit the subscribe button. And you would then have a fuel gauge and you could retro update your manual trim, i.e. the knob, to electronic trim. And for me, that's really cool because that's an original OEM detail that you can still do to this day. In reality, not a lot of the racers did those modifications because that was more of a recreational thing, a little bit like nowadays when people spec the speakers and some people don't spec the speakers. When I got my Seadoo Spark, I actually paid the fee to have DES fitted to my ski. It's a little bit like that with the HX. You have to have a certain wiring harness, which I've had to search high and low for, and that then allows you to basically install those 2 additional gauges. But back then, they used the HX as a base model product, and then you would tear it up. Whereas with the XP, the 787, the reason it was called the Limited, because it was the flagship model, so it had a lot of those bells and whistles built into it. Now, nowadays, we look at the XPs, the X4s, as pretty stripped back rider machines. But by comparison to a HX was your elite rider ski, very stripped back, and then the XP was more of your luxury model, and then obviously you had the 3-seaters that fold in and around that as well. Now the bit that you're all interested in, and the bit that I teased at the beginning of this video, the HX was designed to go straight up against the Blaster, right? So what actually happened? Which was better? Now, better's a hard word to distinguish because it's subjective to which brand you like, and you're always going to have that, guys. But how did it stack up against the iconic Blaster 1? The truth is, Yamaha fans are going to argue one way and HX fans are going to argue the other. So this is a lose-lose for me, but I've gone from the data, I've gone back and looked at the race results and the prominence of how many of the greats were riding the HX versus the Blaster, and the HX comes out on top in most of these scenarios, which I know if you're a Blaster fan, I know you're going to hate that, but it's practical, right guys? The HX was narrower, it was introduced slightly later than the Blaster one, and they had this proprietary technology with the seat and the trim, like I said. So although it was less horsepower, it was a more effective hull, or at least that's the consensus. It's crazy to think, but by today's standards, all of the skis from the 90s are incredibly small, narrow hulls. So when I start talking about the nuances of the Blaster and the HX were even more narrow than the XP or the Raider, they were a lot more narrow, and for that time, it was a certain style of hull for a certain style of rider. When we talk about modern day and you hear me campaigning for literally just bringing back an XP, that shows you how far we've drifted from the capabilities of what was going on in the 90s. The reality of maybe getting a Blaster 1 or a HX in the modern day is very, very slim, like the chance is tiny. Getting an XP or a Raider philosophy, more so, that's more likely. Where I'm going with this is when we talk about the differences of how the HX was more narrow than the XP, imagine how crazily narrow the HX is by today's standard. It's almost like, as my dad would say, sitting on top of a cork, a wine bottle cork. And when you look at the HX and I look at it in the garage, it is so narrow. It's great for storage in the garage, and I cannot wait to ride it. Next year should hopefully be the time when we get out on that. The backdrop to all of this is people modded the hell out of them back in the day. So what a stock ski looked like versus a modded ski, exponentially different. This channel, as we know, is very OEM driven, so I'm looking at these on an OEM basis. When we get into the look and feel of these machines, whether you think a Blurpool or the Red Blaster was nicer than HX, the one thing that's true for them all is how iconic and bold the color palette was. We had the retro, very vibrant color palette, which coupled with the the product styling, like a spring seat. When do you see that sort of thing nowadays? Or the splashes of paint style graphics down the side? It's been lost. We've spoke about it at length, but that is one of the things that made the HX so iconic. If you see a stock, pristine example of a HX, it's a beautiful example of where product styling and decals come together to create this really distinctive look. If you stand next to a HX, it has something special. It has an oddness to it, but in a good way. If you stand next to an XP feels like it conforms more to that period. It followed the same convention we expected to see. The HX did not. Even to this day, the HX has a distinctive fan base the same way the Blaster does, and a lot of that is to do with the razor sharp turning, but also the distinctive look and feel. So whilst the Seadoo HX may have been short-lived, it may have only been around for 3 years, boy was it iconic, boy did it inform what was to come with the XP, and if you can bag yourself one, nearly 30 years removed, you've done yourself very proud. I managed to pick up with my dad last year, end of 2023, a 1996, so I actually have middle of the production span, only 3 years, and we've been spending all of 24 restoring it, doing those cool modifications, OEM modifications, like I said, we're bringing the gauges in, engines came out, we've gone through the whole thing, I've been tracing decals to get it beautifully perfect. In 1997, small little fun fact, Seadoo introduced a fuel gauge, a basic fuel gauge, not the LCD version, which took up one of the slots and they left one slot available for if you wanted to upgrade to the electric VTS. But come the end of 97, the HX was no more, and that iconic motocross style, lightweight hull had vanished from the Seadoo lineup. Cells dictate everything, and as the age-old saying goes, what wins on a Sunday sells on a Monday. Is that true? I think cells, the recreational riders, also dictate what happens to the HX. A lot of people were buying the XP more so than the HX. And what I find equally crazy, again put it in the comments, there is a lot of backlash, not with the HX but with the XP when they moved from the X4 to the Parabolic V in 97. So much so, Seadoo kept the SPX all the way through to 99. I'll make a dedicated video, put in the comments if you want me to, on the SPX. That's a really cool hull because it took on the baton, carried the flame for the X4 once we obviously saw the XP in the X4 format go in 96. A lot of people say that was a sad day. Whether you're a Seadoo fan or a Yamaha fan, there's one thing that's just facts, and that Seadoo did an amazing job to react to the Blaster and create their own equally unique HX, which had some distinctive features, kind of like what's going on at the moment. People are saying, myself included a little bit, Yamaha, you've copied the Seadoo Spark. Well, maybe Seadoo copied the Blaster in the early 90s, so it's fair, shall we say? Guys, I keep getting asked to make lots of these history videos, so if you like this format, put in the comments, and maybe I'll do the history of the blaster, the history of the GSX. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please consider hitting the subscribe button. This channel's dedicated to classic content, so if you like this sort of thing, then have a look around, show some love to the other videos. Like I said, next year, we're going to be making a whole bunch of videos on the HX, my very own HX, and I'm going to do some cool collaborations. Now is the time to get involved and subscribe. And as always, the philosophy is always the same. Let's keep the classics alive.